Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start today by acknowledging the passing of Bevan Tipene Matua, who was a leader within the Green movement and within Māoridom. He will be sadly missed but well remembered. Mr. Speaker, today we're talking about the budget policy statement, and the Green Party would like to address the 6 pillars that the government has put forward within the budget policy statement. But before we do that, it's important to understand the context within which we approach the government's budget. And for us, the objective of economic policy is to achieve prosperity for New Zealanders, while at the same time cutting our use of natural resources and cutting our pollution. We need prosperity while restoring and protecting the integrity of ecosystems, and that is the definition of sustainability. The government has put forward 6 pillars, the first of which is investment in infrastructure, which actually means roads. What the government's saying is that they want to spend about $20 billion on motorways over the next 10 years, and they want to borrow that money in order to do it. Stephen Joyce says that this is Stephen Joyce's Think Big project. It is a project that takes no account of the 2 giant issues which are currently facing the world. And the 2 giant issues are climate change and the end of cheap oil. This is a project which in fact is in total denial about the 2 greatest realities facing the global economy. Roads mean more greenhouse gas pollution, they mean more oil dependency, they mean more obesity, and they mean more air pollution. The Auckland State of the Environment report was released yesterday. It showed that there had been a 9% increase in kilometres travelled by car in the years 2004 to 2008. That is an extra billion kilometres. As a result, there's been $547 million a year in health costs as a result of that road usage. The problem we have is that the oil import costs on New Zealand are dramatic. The last time oil price peaked in 2008, it had a massive impact on New Zealand's balance of payments figures because it had a big impact on our trade balance. If we don't reduce our dependency on oil, then as oil prices go up again, we will face exactly the same problem. We will find ourselves having to work harder and harder in order to pay for the oil that we import. Last time it was virtually the entire exports of the tourism industry that were required to pay for our oil imports. So a strategy that makes us more dependent on oil imports by investing in motorways is a pretty stupid strategy. The International Energy Agency, which is the international body we all pay to predict future oil prices, the executive director said last year, and I quote, "I can't rule out the possibility of an oil supply constraint in 2013 and 2014, end quote. In December 2009, in their oil market report, the International Energy Agency, which is the international experts that this Parliament pays in order to predict the future prices of oil, it said there's 2 demand scenarios in front of us. One is an oil demand growth of 1.4%, 2009-2014, which would give us an oil crunch in 2014. And they said, well, there's the semi-recessionary strategy growth, which would be of only 0.5% growth globally per annum, which postpones the oil crunch to sometime after 2015. So the International Energy Agency is very clear that we are facing an oil price shock. The Total oil company chief executive said recently that the oil price would rise to more than $145 per barrel on concern supplies may fall short as soon as 2014. Quote, "We are running the risk of another oil crisis when demand outstrips supply around 2014 or 2015. There won't be enough oil and gas by the middle of next decade," said the chief executive officer for Total, or rather his spokesperson, on the second quote. So while oil is getting more expensive and all the experts we pay to give us advice on it are telling us that the price of oil will increase dramatically over the course of the next decade, we are spending, in fact borrowing money to invest in infrastructure that will make us more dependent on oil. And so while the price of emitting greenhouse gas emissions is only going to increase, as prices factored into the international market in greenhouse emissions. And while that's happening, we are building infrastructure which increases our greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we are borrowing money to build the infrastructure that will result in increased greenhouse gas emissions. And so while congestion is a major cost for our urban centres, we are building the infrastructure that induces greater road use and moves the congestion to another point in the road system. We know that only investment in buses, trains, ferries, cycling and walking can actually solve the transport problem, as everyone who's ever done any study in transport actually knows. And instead, what we're doing is borrowing $20 billion over the next decade in order to invest in the one thing we know that does not work, which is brand new motorway projects. National and then Labor before them had a Think Big motorway building project, and it's going to end in tears like the last Think Big project. The second pillar that National has talked about is regulatory reform, which means leaky houses. Now, the last time the ACT party types did a job on cutting red tape in New Zealand, they came up with a thing called the Building Act 1991, which was a laissez-faire piece of legislation which said you can build whatever load of rubbish you like. The cost for that we are currently facing, depending on who you read, is somewhere between $11 billion and $22 billion to fix up the leaky houses as a result of the last attempt to cut red tape in New Zealand. It is a cost comparable in terms of GDP to the devastating earthquake in Chile. Somewhere over 10% of our GDP will have to be spent to fix up the last time we let the ACT Party people decide what regulations should govern the Building Act in New Zealand. It was tremendously expensive. They got rid of the rules that said a builder needed to know how to build a house that would keep the rain out. They said that's the nanny state. We'll get rid of that rule in 1991. It was the National Party and it was developed under the Labor Party government that came before it. They got rid of the rules that says your cladding, external cladding, has to keep the rain out, because a rule like that is clearly nanny state. It's a nanny state rule that says that your house has to keep the rain out. They got rid of the rules that says your framing needed a bit of boron treatment, because that was a nanny state rule. And some of those in the National Party who promote the idea that it was the Greenies that promoted that need to know that in fact this was decided on the New Zealand Standards Committee, where the timber industry had a majority vote over the researchers who opposed the change. So in fact it was a result of the deregulation coming through the New Zealand Standards Committee in which the timber industry had a majority. They got rid of the rules that says your building has to keep the rain out because they think that's nanny state. And tens of thousands of New Zealand households are today having to wear the pain as a result of the last time the National Party deregulated the building industry. So when the ACT Party types put up their ideology around regulatory reform, remember it could again cost us $22 billion, with thousands of families living with the heartache and pain and debt and illness that's all the result. All due to the Rogenomes in Labor and National before that. If we look at another pillar that's being proposed here, if we look at tax reform, in tax reform they're proposing to cut the taxes paid by the top in order to be paid for by an increase in GST, which will fall on those who have the least. The fiscal difficulties that were created by Labor's round of tax cuts just before they left office and by Labor's failure to deal with the housing bubble are real, no question about it. But what the government's proposing to do about it will not fix it. We actually need thoroughgoing tax reform, such as a capital gains tax excluding the family home, which would actually make a difference because it would be highly progressive, it would fall more on the wealthy than the poor, it would broaden the tax base and drive investment away from the housing boom. That would be an important and significant tax reform you could make, not to mention putting a serious price on carbon and a serious price on water, which would actually drive the economy to be more efficient in its use of carbon, its production of carbon and its use of water. Mr. Speaker, we actually need to move our economy in a sustainable direction. We need to reduce our use of resources and our production of pollution, and unfortunately this budget policy statement fails to do that. The only good thing about it is it's not Don Brash's budget policy statement, so dog eat dog is not its central thesis, but it doesn't have a lot of vision. The world is changing, and that is the reality we face. It is constrained in resources and pollutions. That creates fantastic opportunities for new businesses in New Zealand to make a prosperous living out of New Zealand living up to its reputation for being green and for being smart. So once again, I encourage the government to start to steal our ideas rather than steal the inheritance of future generations.